My name is Amelia Anderson, and at 32 years old, I discovered my parents had been lying to me about our family's financial situation my entire life. I was raised on the belief that we were poor, deeply, chronically, soul grindingly poor, and I carried that weight into every decision I made. I skipped every field trip that cost more than $5, worked two jobs through college just to cover tuition and rent, and wore shoes with holes in them long after I should have been able to afford better. But one ordinary Saturday afternoon, while helping clean out my father's garage, I stumbled upon a dusty lockbox buried under old tax returns, and what I found inside rewrote my entire childhood. If you've ever sacrificed because you thought there was no other choice, only to find out someone else was rewriting the rules behind your back, then you'll understand why my hands shook as I read those bank statements. Hit like and subscribe if you've ever lived with less only to find out someone else chose it for you. I used to believe hardship bonded people. I thought being broke together made our little family stronger, tighter, maybe even nobler in some weird, suffering is holy kind of way. My mother, Diane, always said things like, "We may not have much, but we have love." And my father, Walter, would add with a gruff pat on my back, "Hard work builds character. Better than silver spoons." I clung to those words when I was 12 and had to explain to my classmates why I never had new school supplies, or when I was 16 and declined my crush's invitation to prom because I couldn't afford a dress. I didn't resent them then. Not really. I pitied them. I thought they were trying their best with what little they had. I thought our poverty was unfortunate, but honorable. The house I grew up in didn't scream poverty. It was modest, sure. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, faded siding that badly needed repainting, but it wasn't falling apart. We had heat in the winter and a working fridge, and my parents had 2 used but functional cars. Still, every time I asked for anything, ballet lessons, a trip to the mall with friends, even a birthday sleepover, I was met with the same phrase: "We can't afford it." That sentence was so ingrained into my childhood that I still hear it when I browse the sale rack at department stores. And I believed it. Why wouldn't I? My parents never showed signs of extravagance. No flashy jewelry, no vacations, not even takeout. They made austerity look like a virtue. In middle school, I started collecting aluminum cans from school lunches, saving pennies like it might one day buy me something beautiful. I remember the shame of the lunch lady gently asking if I qualified for the free meal program and the quiet humiliation of always saying yes. I was grateful for the help, but it carved something into me, a belief that I was always dependent, always on the edge. Even when I got straight A's and praise from teachers, there was always the underlying whisper, "Don't dream too big, Amelia. People like us can't afford big dreams." College was both my liberation and my burden. I got into a decent state school with scholarships, but they didn't cover everything. I worked the early shift at the library and closed at a diner near campus, sometimes studying in the walk-in freezer on breaks just to stay awake. My roommates came from families that could float them a few $100 when rent was tight or send care packages with real snacks. I got used to saying, "No thanks, I'm good," while silently counting quarters to do laundry. I never told my parents how hard it was. I assumed they already felt bad enough, and I didn't want to add to their guilt. I thought they had sacrificed for me. I thought I was carrying our shared burden. The first time I questioned anything was after I graduated. I got a decent job in marketing and visited home with a modest gift, a framed diploma I had paid to have professionally matted. My father barely looked at it before saying, "Just don't forget where you came from." At the time, I took that as pride. Now, I hear it differently. That same weekend, I noticed my mother's old car had been replaced by a newer model. She waved it off as a lucky deal from a friend at the dealership, and I didn't press. But little things kept adding up. Their yard got professionally landscaped. They got a new washing machine, the kind with a digital touchscreen. Then came the garage remodel, and I started to wonder. I wouldn't say I was suspicious, not at first.
Just confused.
Curious. I chalked it up to maybe an inheritance from a distant relative or a late-life raise I hadn't heard about. I didn't ask directly because in our family, money was never discussed. That was the unspoken rule. Asking about money was rude, disrespectful even. So I kept working, budgeting, saving every extra dollar, even as the puzzle pieces didn't quite fit. Then last summer, I came home to help my father clean out the garage before a city inspection. He was getting older, and I thought I was doing a good deed. Somewhere between stacks of old newspapers and rusted gardening tools, I found a metal box wedged behind a shelf. It was locked, but the key was taped underneath. I hesitated, of course I did. I knew it wasn't mine. But something pulled at me, a thread that had been tugging for years. I opened it. Inside were bank statements, crisp, sorted by year, tucked in sleeves like collectibles. Not just savings accounts, but investment portfolios. Retirement funds. One checking account had a balance of over $140,000. The account had been active since I was 9. And it wasn't an inheritance. The dates, the deposits, it was regular. Monthly. Intentional. I sat there on the concrete floor, fingers trembling as I flipped through decades of silent abundance. My face burned as the realization hit me. We weren't poor. Not by accident. Not by misfortune. We were poor because they wanted me to believe we were. And I still don't know what hurts more, that they lied to me or that they made me believe my struggles were inevitable. That every moment of deprivation, every birthday I pretended I didn't care about, every shame-soaked memory of patching my own jeans with old scraps, that none of it was necessary. My parents had the means. They just chose not to use them for me. Tell me, have you ever uncovered a truth so deep, so deliberately buried, that it made you question your entire life? Let me know in the comments if something like this has ever happened to you. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you've ever been kept in the dark by the people who were supposed to protect you. Before I can explain what I did next, you need to understand how far back this lie goes. So let me take you to the beginning, when I was just a little girl, proud of my brown lunch bag and blind to the weight it carried. I grew up in a small, damp house tucked into the southern edge of a Missouri town nobody drives through unless they're lost. Our place was old, drafty in the winter, blistering in the summer, with floors that creaked like they were trying to speak up about their age. But I didn't think of it as anything less than home. When I was little, I thought that's just how everyone lived, bundled in mismatched socks under 3 quilts in January and spending long August nights trying to fall asleep with a wet washcloth on your forehead. My parents, Diane and Walter Anderson, had created a very specific narrative for our lives. We were barely scraping by, living paycheck to paycheck, and doing our best with what God gave us. I heard these phrases, so often they became part of my internal monologue.
I didn't resent them then.
In fact, I felt proud, like I was part of some noble, working-class struggle that gave me grit and humility. My earliest memories are stained with sacrifice. Not theirs, mine. When I was 5, I remember my mother gently folding back the corners of my birthday cards and setting aside any cash that fell out. She'd smile sweetly and say, "We'll put this in your college fund, baby." I never saw a dime of that money. Later, I learned she meant her grocery envelope, the one she kept in her apron. At 7, I watched my father frown at a $12 permission slip for a zoo field trip and mutter, "Do they think money grows on trees?" I didn't go. At 9, I found out what reduced lunch meant when I was handed a bright orange tray and the cashier smiled at me just a little too kindly. I had no idea how deeply all these little humiliations were being woven into the fabric of who I would become. There was a system in our household, an intricate economy built on guilt and silence. My mother couponed like it was an Olympic sport. She'd spend hours with circulars, scissors in hand, murmuring to herself about BOGOs and rebates. My father had a routine so rigid you could set your watch by it. Coffee at 6, work boots on by 6:30, and out the door before 7. He worked at a local factory, at least that's what I believed. It was only years later that I realized he'd quietly taken on a side hustle repairing HVAC units and installing water heaters for neighbors and friends, all under the table. He never mentioned it to me. I only learned about it when I stumbled upon a file folder labeled Anderson Home Services tucked into a drawer in his office when I was 15. Even then, I told myself it was probably just something small. He always said he did whatever it took to keep the lights on. The real trick wasn't the money. It was the language. My parents were fluent in martyrdom. Everything they did was couched in sacrifice. "We're eating spaghetti again because your father works too hard to complain," my mom would say as she served up another bowl of overcooked noodles. "You think we want to say no to the school dance? We hate it more than you do," my father would grumble. There was always a tone of loving regret, a kind of weary nobility in their voices that made me feel guilty even for wanting more. I stopped asking for things by the time I was 11. By 13, I had a babysitting business and started secretly stashing cash in a sock under my mattress. Not to save up for something fun just in case they needed it. That's the most twisted part. They didn't need it, but they let me believe they did. I remember once, when I was 14, the power went out during a storm. My mother lit candles and told me softly, "We're going to have to make it a game, sweetie. Pretend we're pioneers." I later found out the outage wasn't from the storm. It was because the bill had gone unpaid by choice. She'd redirected the money to a rainy day envelope for an upcoming cruise. A cruise. She never mentioned it. I overheard her talking about it to her sister on the phone, whispering in the laundry room, thinking I was asleep. At school, I never fit in with the kids who had. I had 2 pairs of jeans that fit me at any given time, and my shoes always had some evidence of duct tape or glued-on soles. Field trips were rare, and dances were skipped entirely. I got very good at excuses. "I'm grounded," I'd say. Or, "My uncle's visiting from out of town." Anything to avoid admitting we couldn't afford the $10 admission. But now I know that wasn't true. We could. They just wouldn't. I think they liked me small, quiet, dependent. I think they liked knowing I wouldn't ask. By the time I reached high school, I had learned to wear my poverty like armor. I became the hardworking girl, the one teachers admired for her grit and determination. I took AP classes, worked weekends at the library, and tutored freshmen after school, all because I had a sense that if I didn't crawl my way out of that house, I'd never leave it. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Blanchard, once pulled me aside and said, "You've got drive, Amelia. You remind me of myself at your age. Don't let your circumstances keep you here." I nearly cried. It was the first time anyone acknowledged the weight I was carrying. What I didn't know then, what makes my stomach turn now, is that my circumstances were manufactured. My parents orchestrated a life of lack for reasons I still can't fully understand. Was it about control? About shaping me into someone they could manage, someone who'd never dreamed too big or pushed too hard? Or was it simply easier for them to feign struggle than to parent a child who might one day question why she'd been denied so much? I got my first taste of freedom when I moved into the dorms at 19. I had a hand-me-down suitcase and $120 in my bank account. I remember sitting on that twin bed with the scratchy blue comforter, staring out the window at the quad below, and feeling something like hope for the first time in my life. College wasn't easy. I juggled coursework and late night shifts, still sending birthday cards home and pretending everything was fine. My parents praised me for being so independent, but they never offered help. Not once. And I didn't ask. I didn't think I had the right. Years passed. I graduated, got my first apartment, bought furniture from thrift stores, and built a life that felt fragile but mine. I still lived like I was poor. It was muscle memory by then, cutting coupons, reusing Ziploc bags, panicking if my checking account dipped below $200. I never vacationed. I never splurged. Even after getting promoted twice, I couldn't shake the fear that one bad month would collapse everything. It never occurred to me that maybe I didn't have to live like that. That maybe someone else had the safety net all along. I wish I could say there was some big moment that made me question everything. But the truth is, it was more like a slow drip of unease. An offhand comment here, a suspicious upgrade there. One Christmas, I noticed my mother's new bracelet. It sparkled a little too much for a woman who once cried over the price of baby carrots. When I asked about it, she said, "Oh, it's just costume jewelry." But later, I saw her wiping it gently with a velvet cloth. Costume jewelry doesn't need that kind of care. I noticed more envelopes being dropped off by couriers. My father had a new hobby, stock trading, which he never mentioned before. The puzzle started coming together long before I found that lockbox. But I was still clinging to the story I'd been raised with because letting go of it meant reevaluating everything. And I wasn't ready to do that. Not yet. Looking back now, I wonder how many other people are walking around with inherited poverty, not the kind that comes from a system stacked against them, but the kind that comes from lies, from calculated deprivation, from parents who would rather teach humility through hunger than honesty. If that's you, I see you. If you've ever doubted your own instincts because the people who raised you taught you not to trust them, I get it. And if you're still trying to untangle truth from legacy, stick with me. Because the moment I opened that lockbox wasn't the end of the story. It was just the start of me finally asking questions. And the answers I found next, they weren't just about money. They were about power, silence, and a very specific kind of betrayal. After I opened that lockbox and saw the numbers for myself, something inside me split, cleanly, permanently, like a bone that's been under pressure too long and finally gives way. At first, I sat there in the garage, hunched over those neat little stacks of paper, hoping there was some logical explanation. I wanted there to be one. Maybe it was a trust fund set up by a generous uncle. Maybe my parents had secretly won the lottery but hadn't figured out how to tell me. Maybe. But the deposits were regular and long-standing, going back decades, some made during years when I was told we couldn't afford dental cleanings or new backpacks. There were handwritten notes in my father's blocky print, terms like liquid assets, high yield, and diversify. None of it was recent. He'd known exactly what he was doing. And suddenly I realized I didn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, the same faded posters still clinging to the walls, the air conditioner rattling like it always had. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about every cold winter morning I'd walk to the bus stop in layers of mismatched wool while my classmates hopped into warm SUVs. I remembered the brown bag lunches with peanut butter sandwiches, no jelly, because we can't waste money on extras. I remembered hearing my parents argue in hushed voices behind closed doors and always assuming it was because they were drowning in bills. But now I had to reconsider. Were they even arguing about money? Or had they just gotten used to playing that part so well they couldn't tell when the performance had ended? I decided not to confront them right away. Part of me still clung to hope. Maybe they had a reason, however twisted. Maybe they'd explain, and it would all make sense. But as the weekend passed, I watched my father joke about rising gas prices while he sipped imported whiskey, and I caught my mother checking her phone for stock updates during dinner. They didn't speak like people struggling. They didn't move like people afraid. And once I'd seen behind the curtain, I couldn't unsee it. Their performance no longer landed. Their lines sounded hollow. Their silences suddenly screamed. Back in my apartment, I went into research mode. I combed through every old email I'd ever gotten from them, every birthday card, every financial lesson they'd passed down like gospel. I even pulled out the notebook I'd used in college to budget my meal plan points because my parents had insisted they couldn't contribute a dime to my tuition. And there it was again and again: sacrifice,
Pride.
false humility, the mythology of the noble poor. They'd built an entire identity around it and made sure I swallowed every word. But what gnawed at me most wasn't the money. It was the control. How many decisions had I made based on a lie? What kind of person might I have been if I'd believed I could ask for help? If I'd known I was allowed to want more? I realized then that the greatest theft wasn't financial. It was the theft of permission. They hadn't just deprived me of comforts, they deprived me of confidence, of opportunity, of choice. I kept circling back to college, to all the hours I'd spent folding laundry for rich families and stocking shelves late into the night while my classmates went out for drinks or joined student clubs. I remembered the time my computer crashed 2 days before finals, and I had to write all my essays at the campus library, praying no one else needed the last open computer. When I called my mom crying, desperate, she'd said, "I'm sorry, honey. We just can't help you. Things are tight right now." That was in 2013. I found a bank statement showing $9,000 deposit into her savings account that same week. So I called my best friend, Jess. We'd met in college, bonded over Burt coffee and intro to psych lectures, and stuck together ever since. She picked up after one ring. "You okay? You sound like you're calling from the bottom of a well." "I found something at my parents' house," I said slowly, my voice hollow. "And I think my whole childhood was a lie." Jess didn't interrupt. She never did. I told her everything, every detail, every bank statement, every penny that contradicted the story I'd been fed. By the end, I was shaking. They had money, Jess. They had so much money. And they let me suffer.
I.
"I don't even know what to say," she whispered.
That's sick.
"I feel like a fool," I admitted. Like they saw me struggling and just let me. "No," she said fiercely. "You're not a fool. You're someone who trusted her parents. That's what kids are supposed to do." Her words were a bomb, but they didn't stitch me back together. Nothing could, not really. Because once trust is broken that deeply, it doesn't mend, it mutates. It becomes something else. Wariness. Calculation. Distance. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't a one-time oversight. This was strategic. A pattern. And the deeper I dug, the more threads unraveled. I remembered asking for help with textbooks my freshman year, only to be told, "Use the library." That's what we did in the old days. I remembered bringing home a report card full of A's in high school and hearing, "That's nice, but don't expect a reward. We don't do that participation trophy nonsense." I remembered watching my father take my little cousin shopping for school clothes one summer. He bought him brand new sneakers and a winter coat, things I'd never been given without a lecture. At the time, I told myself it was kindness. Now I wondered if it was something else. A mask. A performance. A distraction. I couldn't help but replay my mother's words over the years. "We're a family, Amelia. We stick together. We don't depend on outsiders. It sounded noble at the time. Now it sounded like a threat, a warning, a leash. Eventually, I stopped sleeping. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning, clutching my blanket, heart racing like I was still that little girl afraid to ask for lunch money. Only now I knew better. Now I knew the fear wasn't about survival. It was about obedience. They taught me to struggle not because they had to, but because they wanted me to. Because control, cloaked in struggle, is easier to justify. You can dress it up as lessons and resilience. You can call it tough love. But it's still a cage. A week later, I returned to their house under the pretense of picking up old books from the attic. I needed more evidence. I needed to know if there were other lockboxes, other secrets. And there were. I found tax returns hidden in the back of a filing cabinet, investment plans with my father's signature, an insurance policy taken out when I was 16 for me, but without my knowledge. I found a travel folder labeled Italy 2004, complete with hotel receipts, currency exchange stubs, and a photo of them smiling on a gondola, taken the same summer I spent every day alone because they said they couldn't afford a sitter. I sat in their driveway afterward, clutching that photo, my vision blurry from tears. I wasn't crying for them. I was crying for her, the girl I used to be. The girl who worked so hard to earn what she already deserved. The girl who believed her pain meant something. That it was shaping her into someone better. Stronger. Worthy. That version of me didn't know she was being manipulated. She didn't know her struggle wasn't noble. It was unnecessary. And the rage that followed? It wasn't explosive. It was quiet. Cold. It moved through me like ice water. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to plan. I had one goal now, to confront them with everything, but not just for my own peace of mind. I needed them to understand what they'd done. I needed them to see the girl they created and the woman I'd become despite them, not because of them. And I needed to do it on my terms. I waited 2 weeks before I confronted them. Not because I was unsure, my certainty by then had hardened into something immovable, but because I wanted control over the moment. I wanted the setting, the tone, the audience to be mine. My parents had controlled the narrative for 32 years, shaped me in silence and shadows. If this conversation was going to happen, it would be on my ground. So I invited them over for dinner. I told them I wanted to catch up, that I had something to show them from my apartment renovation. My mother, ever the curious homemaker, agreed immediately. My father's reply was just 2 words. "We'll come." I spent the entire day preparing, not the food, store-bought lasagna was fine, but myself. I printed copies of the bank statements, the tax returns, the investment records. I laid them all out in a tidy manila folder, labeled for discussion. I wasn't sure if I would slide it across the table or throw it down, but I needed it close. It felt like a weapon, though I knew I wouldn't need to raise my voice. My power was in the knowing. I even made a small list on a post-it note, just a few words. Zoo trip, Italy photo, college textbooks, orange lunch tray. Symbols of a childhood I now understood had been distorted on purpose. When they arrived, my mother gave me a kiss on the cheek and complimented the vase of peonies on my table. My father grunted his approval at the apartment's new floors. They chatted about the traffic and the neighbor's broken sprinkler system, like this was any other evening. I watched them move through the space I had carved out for myself with so much sacrifice, sitting on the couch I'd bought secondhand, under the light fixture I'd installed after watching a dozen DIY videos, and I felt like I was seeing strangers for the first time. Strangers who had known me all along and used that knowledge not to protect, but to contain. We ate dinner with the usual pleasantries. My mother talked about the church potluck. My father mentioned the stock market in passing, something about needing to move some things around before the end of the quarter. My grip tightened on my fork. I let them finish their meal before I spoke. "I found the lockbox," I said evenly. My mother blinked. "What lockbox?" "In the garage. Under the tax files." I turned to my father. "You remember the one, right? With the bank statements and the investment portfolios, all neatly labeled." There was a long pause. My father looked at my mother. My mother's face didn't change, but I noticed the way she set her fork down, carefully, precisely, like she knew what was coming. "I didn't snoop," I said, anticipating the objection. "I was helping clean, and it was sitting there unlocked, next to the folder labeled HVAC receipts, which, by the way, were more thorough than any financial help you ever gave me." "You went through our personal documents," my mother said, her voice tight. "No," I replied, sliding the folder onto the table between us. "I uncovered the truth." My father sighed, a long, theatrical exhale that I recognized from childhood. It was his way of signaling disappointment before speaking. "Amelia, it's not what you think." "Really?" I asked, flipping open the folder and pushing a statement toward them. "Because what I think is that you had money, plenty of it, and you lied to me for 32 years. You let me believe we were barely surviving while you were moving money into retirement accounts and taking European vacations." My mother finally spoke, her voice low and measured. "We did what we thought was best. Struggle builds character." That sentence hit me like a slap. "No," I said, leaning forward. "Struggle builds silence. It builds shame. It builds children who don't ask for help because they think they don't deserve it." I didn't build character. I built walls. And I built them with your lies. "We wanted to teach you responsibility," my father said. "To raise you right." I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the absurdity of it made rage coil tight in my chest. "Responsibility? You watched me wear shoes with holes in them while you were buying designer handbags for Aunt Linda. You told me there was no money for college textbooks while you were investing in mutual funds. You didn't teach me responsibility. You taught me fear." They didn't deny it. That was the part that undid me most. They didn't even try. My mother looked tired, but not remorseful. "We didn't think you'd take it so personally." "You didn't think I'd figured out," I corrected. There was a beat of silence then, heavy and long. "Do you know what I remember most?" I said, quieter now. "The zoo trip in 3rd grade. All the other kids had cameras and snacks and parents waving from the bus. I had to sit out because you said we couldn't afford the $12. I cried in the nurse's office because I was embarrassed. And now I know that was a lie. That's what you taught me, that I was never worth $12. "Amelia," my mother started, but I raised a hand.
No, don't.
"You don't get to explain it away anymore. You made choices. You made me believe that we were barely hanging on while you tucked away enough money to fund 3 college educations. And the worst part isn't even the money. It's that you let me believe I wasn't worth it. That every no was because of the world, not because of you." My father stared at the folder. He didn't say anything. My mother's lips were pressed together so tightly they were turning white. "I worked 2 jobs in college," I said. "You remember that? I once passed out at the library because I hadn't eaten in 16 hours. And I didn't tell you because I thought you were barely making it yourselves. I didn't want to be a burden. But you let me carry that anyway, alone." I stood up then, not because I was storming out, but because I needed to end it on my feet, upright, grounded in the self I had finally come to know. The woman who no longer had to carry the burden of their story. "You should leave," I said calmly. "We're done here." My mother opened her mouth, but I shook my head. "No apologies tonight. Not when they'd only exist to make you feel better." They stood slowly. My father looked like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. Maybe he knew it wouldn't matter. Maybe he finally realized that control, once lost, doesn't come back. After they left, I sat alone in the quiet, the folder still open on the table. The documents weren't just financial records anymore. They were testimony, proof that I had never been crazy, that the things I felt were real, that the lack I lived through wasn't some shared hardship, it was imposed. There's something freeing about the truth, even when it burns. It doesn't fix the past. It doesn't return stolen time. But it gives you the power to start rewriting the story. And for the first time in my life, that story would be mine. The fallout wasn't immediate. That surprised me. I half expected a barrage of texts or a dramatic voicemail from my mother, some teary apology or a bitter retort. But instead, the silence from my parents stretched out like a thick fog, quiet, heavy, and full of implications. At first, I thought it was the calm before the storm. I braced myself for some dramatic show of regret or anger. But nothing came. Days passed. Then a week.
2.
No calls.
No emails.
Not even a passive-aggressive Facebook comment. Just silence. And for a while, that silence felt like power. It felt like I had finally taken the story out of their hands and placed it back into mine. But quiet has a way of exposing everything. The longer I sat with the absence of my parents' voices, the more space I had to hear my own. And what I heard wasn't as triumphant as I'd hoped. It was complicated. There was anger. Yes, a deep well of it that still rose up in me when I remembered how I used to wash out plastic baggies and save dryer lint to make fire starters because I thought we couldn't afford basics. But underneath the fury was something far more disorienting: grief. A grief I hadn't expected. Grief for the childhood I'd never had. Grief for the girl who had believed she was just unlucky, not manipulated. Grief for all the times I blamed myself for not working hard enough, when in reality, the rules had been rigged from the start. I found myself waking up in the middle of the night with those memories replaying like old home movies. Me eating plain rice while my classmates ordered cafeteria pizza. Me patching up a coat for the third winter in a row. Me watching my mother cry over a utility bill while she secretly stashed money in a high-yield account. I'd sit up in bed and stare into the dark, not crying, not moving, just trying to make sense of the betrayal. One afternoon, I ran into my mother at the grocery store. It was the first time I'd seen her since the confrontation. She was walking toward the produce section, sunglasses on, pushing her cart like nothing had happened. I was near the apples, gripping a bag of Honeycrisps, my heart beating in my ears. She didn't see me at first. I could have ducked out. I could have left the cart and walked straight out the automatic doors. But I didn't. I stood there and waited for her to see me. Her eyes flicked up, met mine, and for the briefest moment, something raw crossed her face. Regret, maybe, or just discomfort. But then her lips curled into a polite smile. Not a mother's smile. A stranger's. "Amelia," she said, stopping her cart. "Diane," I said back, using her first name for the first time in my life. It wasn't a choice. I didn't think about it. It just came out. Her eyes flickered. "You look tired." "I am," I said. "Grief is exhausting." That got to her. She looked away, toward the oranges, like they might offer her a better escape than I ever had. I let the silence stretch between us, not to punish her, but because I'd spent my entire life filling those gaps for her, smoothing things over, and I was done doing that. "I didn't come here to fight," she finally said. "I didn't come here to see you," I replied. She looked down at her hands, perfectly manicured as always, and nodded. "Your father's been quiet since that night." "He can stay quiet," I said. "I spent most of my life trying to earn scraps of affection from you too. I don't need to do that anymore." She sighed, and for the first time, I saw her face, really saw it. Not the curated version, not the performance of the selfless mother. I saw her as a woman with 100 choices behind her, most of which I'd never know. And I wondered, briefly, what her childhood had looked like. Had someone taught her that withholding was a form of love? Had someone convinced her that controlling me was the same thing as protecting me? "You were always so strong," she said quietly. "We just didn't want you to grow up entitled." That was the moment I felt the ice return. Cold, crisp clarity. "You didn't want me to feel entitled to safety, or comfort, or help. You wanted me to be grateful for deprivation. You succeeded." She didn't reply. She just gave a tight nod and pushed her cart past me.
No apology. No confession.
Just more silence. And that was the last time I saw her. After that day, I stopped waiting for closure from them. I stopped imagining some future confrontation that would finally end in tears, hugs, and mutual understanding. I let go of that fantasy. It wasn't real. What was real was the life I had built in spite of them. I started therapy. Not the once a month, check in and dip out kind, but the hard kind. The kind where you sit with the version of yourself you spent years trying to ignore. I talked about growing up poor, but not poor in resources, poor in love that was honest, in affection that was unconditional. I unpacked how deeply that lie had shaped my sense of self-worth. I saw clearly how many of my relationships had been built around self-denial and overachievement, as if I had to earn my place in every room. My therapist called it scarcity mindset. I called it childhood. In therapy, I also confronted a harder truth. Some part of me still wanted my parents' approval. Not their money, not their help, just their recognition. I wanted them to say, "We were wrong." I wanted them to see me now and understand what they'd broken. But the chances of that were slim. And I couldn't live my life waiting for people who'd spent decades lying to decide they were finally ready to be honest. So I made a decision. I went to my bank and opened a trust. Not a big one, not flashy, just enough to help fund college savings for kids who'd aged out of the foster system. I didn't do it for recognition. I didn't even put my name on the donor list. I did it because I had spent too long living in lack, and I needed to believe that someone somewhere could use a different kind of story. One where help wasn't a trick, where generosity wasn't conditional. I also started spending my money differently. I bought new shoes without guilt. I planned a vacation to Oregon just because I'd always wanted to hike the cliffs. I bought flowers for my apartment every week, fresh ones, not the fake arrangements my mother used to buy on clearance. And I didn't do it to prove anything. I did it because I could. Freedom, I realized, isn't just about walking away from the people who hurt you. It's about walking toward the version of yourself they tried to prevent. The self that believes she is worthy. Of comfort. Of truth.
Of joy.
Sometimes I still wonder what my life might have looked like if they'd told the truth from the beginning. If I'd grown up knowing I was worth investing in. But I don't dwell there for long, because wondering won't change the past. And for the first time in a long time, I'm not living in the past. I'm living in the life I built without their permission. It's strange how healing rarely looks the way you imagine it. I used to picture it like some dramatic, sweeping crescendo, a reckoning, a breakdown followed by a breakthrough. But what actually came was quieter. slower, less cinematic. It looked like long walks after dinner and nights I finally slept without dreams soaked in shame. It looked like deleting voicemails from my parents without listening to them and not even feeling a twinge of guilt. It looked like lighting a candle on a random Tuesday just because it smelled like something lovely and warm. Healing didn't come in one glorious moment. It arrived gradually, in the dozens of small decisions to stop shrinking inside a story someone else wrote for me. I started talking more openly about my past. At first, just in therapy. Then, slowly, with people I trusted, Jess, my coworker Nicole, even a few acquaintances who had once confided in me about their own complicated families. I wasn't looking for pity. I was trying to scrape away at the isolation I'd lived under for so long. It was staggering how many women had their own versions of my story. Not always about money, but always about power. About being made to feel smaller for the comfort of others. And the more I shared, the more I found that what I'd always believed to be personal shame was actually part of a collective wound. Something we were all carrying, quietly alone. One evening, I went to a gathering at Jess's place. Nothing fancy, just wine, snacks, and a handful of women with stories tucked behind their eyes. The topic turned, eventually, to childhood. Someone mentioned how her father used guilt like a blade. Another spoke about the constant instability of moving from apartment to apartment because her mother couldn't keep a job, even though she always had new shoes. When it came around to me, I hesitated. Then I said, "My parents told me we were poor my whole life. They made me believe every hardship was unchangeable. But they weren't poor. Not even close." The room went quiet for a beat. And then something remarkable happened. No one gasped. No one offered a trite, "I'm so sorry." Instead, someone said softly, "Mine too." Not money, but love. They made it scarce, so I'd behave. Another woman nodded. "They kept you grateful for crumbs. That's the trick." That night, I walked home in the crisp air, and for the first time since opening that lockbox, I didn't feel alone. I felt understood. And that was worth more than any apology I was still waiting on. My parents never tried to make things right, not really. My mother sent a Christmas card in December, signed only "Love, Mom and Dad," without a message. There was no gift, no call, just that hollow gesture. I placed it in a drawer and didn't respond. Months later, my father emailed me a link to a TED Talk about resilience. No text. No context. Just the link. It was almost funny in its irony. I didn't click it. I stopped trying to decipher their actions. I stopped expecting them to become people they never had the courage to be. I'd spent too many years turning their silence into questions I thought I was supposed to answer. But now I understand. Their silence is their choice. And mine is mine. In the spring, I started volunteering with a local scholarship foundation. I reviewed essays from high school seniors, most of them first-generation college applicants, most of them working part-time jobs, balancing grades and life like I once had. One girl wrote about her mother's addiction, how she hid her honor roll certificates in a shoebox because there was no one to show them to. Another wrote about selling handmade jewelry to afford the SAT fee. I read their stories with tears in my eyes, not because I pitied them, but because I recognized something sacred in them. Not struggle, not suffering, but survival. And the way they turned their pain into momentum. For my part, I donated to their books fund. Quietly. Anonymously. I didn't want my name on anything. I didn't want credit. I just wanted to rewrite, even a little, the story for someone else. The irony, of course, is that I make good money now. I have a stable career, benefits, a savings account that doesn't keep me up at night. And yet, I still pause before buying myself anything that feels like a luxury. That reflex doesn't disappear overnight. But I'm learning. I'm learning to distinguish frugality from fear. To ask myself, do I want this? Instead of, am I allowed to have this? That shift, however subtle, is everything. There are still moments, though. Flashbacks that sneak in when I least expect it. Like when I buy groceries and instinctively reach for the off-brand cereal, or when I walk past the school supply aisle in August and feel that familiar twist in my stomach. That part of me, that little girl counting pennies under dim kitchen lights, will always be with me. But now I hold her hand instead of hiding her. And maybe that's what healing really is, not erasing the past, but learning how to carry it differently. The last thing I'll say is this. If someone made you feel like needing help was weakness, if someone taught you to earn your worth in ways that cost you joy, I hope you know that wasn't love. That was control dressed in concern. And you don't have to carry that with you anymore. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to dig your way out of someone else's lie just to find your own truth, don't forget to like and subscribe. And thank you truly for listening to my story.